Save the drama for your mama. Don't I wish? Unfortunately, conflict is a part of every organization, including nonprofits, and sometimes especially nonprofits, that are comprised of sometimes hundreds or thousands of individual personality types working together toward a shared goal and mission. But conflict, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, it can have some positive outcomes. So in this lesson, we're going to dive into organizational conflict and individual personality types. This lesson will conclude our discussion on volunteers as a stakeholder group. And in this lesson, we'll discuss how volunteers work in teams, how they navigate conflict, and the role that personality plays. By the end of this lesson, you'll know the difference between groups and teams, and you'll be able to identify common groups and teams in nonprofits. You'll know how high-performing teams are identified per Lencioni's model. You'll understand organizational conflict and 5 common approaches to managing conflict. You'll also be able to define personality and describe those big 5 personality traits. First, let's distinguish between groups and teams because they're not the same thing. Groups are basically any random assembly or grouping of individuals, and they can be coming together for various reasons, either on a formal basis or on their own informally and organically. Now, what makes a group is that they do come together for a shared reason, but they have individual outcomes and they have individual accountability. So when you're doing a group project, for example, when you're first assembled together with other people, you start out as a group because you start out with individual outcomes and accountability. Now, sometimes groups can elevate to teams. Teams are more structured, and this refers to groups of individuals who work collaboratively to achieve shared goals. So the difference here, the big distinction is those shared goals. And another big distinction is that teams also require collective accountability as opposed to individual accountability. So all teams are groups and meet that group definition, but not all groups are teams. So when it comes to groups, it's more about the individual rather than the collective. Now, there are advantages to groups. Groups are much more efficient and they're easy to assemble. If you're working in a nonprofit, you can grab a bunch of volunteers and group them together and ask them to do a task. But to rise to the level of a team with those shared goals and that shared accountability and that collaboration, that requires more of an effort. So it's not always efficient, but they can be more productive. Now let's talk about the types of groups that are common in nonprofits. And remember, groups, they're not the same thing as teams. Formal groups are those that are formally assembled. Leaders get together, they determine there's a specific task that needs to be achieved, and they'll assemble a formal group. So work groups or volunteer committees are formal group examples. Informal groups happen naturally. Sometimes people bond over shared interests or identities. For example, if you're a recent college graduate and you start a job in a nonprofit, you might find yourself informally grouping together with other people of your age and in your peer group, and you start getting together for a weekly trivia night, things like that. So groups allow for greater individual growth because of the individualized nature of groups versus teams. And there's that individualized nature of accountability and responsibility. So in a group, it's more about the individual rather than the collective. So a lot of those volunteer committees that are assembled for a specific task, like planning a fundraising event, those are generally an example of a formal group. Now, as that group works together over time and that individualized nature starts to morph into a collective, shared outcomes, shared accountability, shared responsibility, that group may elevate and transition from a group into a team. But most assemblies of people, they start out at least as a group. Now let's look at different team types that are common in nonprofit organizations. Departmental or functional teams are teams composed of individuals who work within the same department or the same functional area. Previously, we talked about the importance of job design and organizational design. And in that discussion, we addressed the fact that often in organizations, we group people together based on department and or function. So if your responsibility is marketing, you're probably going to be grouped into a department or a team of other people that are in charge for marketing, communications, and public relations. Because the type of your work, the nature of your work, it's very common, it's similar. You usually have that collective shared goal around marketing. So if a nonprofit is departmentalized based on function, that is an example of a team. Task forces and committees are assembled to address specific issues or to make decisions. In a previous lesson, we talked about ad hoc advisory boards. So ad hoc means temporary or for a specific purpose, and the advisory board is there to give advice. They're not a governing role. So task forces are usually similar to ad hoc boards. Task forces are assembled for a temporary basis and for a specific purpose. Committees are longer term, and these are common in nonprofits. So you might group together a bunch of volunteers to be a group. Then as that group continues to work together, especially if it's for a long-term basis, that group then transitions to become a team. And that committee is functioning as a team. Teams require more effort to form. They take longer sometimes because you're building these relationships. And the downside of teams is you won't experience as much individual growth as you would in a group. But the positive of teams is they typically result in better collaboration, problem solving, brainstorming, and obviously team building. Now that you know the difference between groups and teams, and that all teams are groups, but not all groups are teams, let's talk about how we can identify high-performing teams using Lencioni's model. Now, the reason we assemble teams is to perform. We have a goal that we need them to achieve as a collective, as a collaborative unit. But to achieve high-performing teams, we need to do a few things. We need to make sure that we're assembling members who have the skills and attitudes needed to achieve team objectives, and that who can trust each other, who can collaborate, who can work together and work well as a team. There's an academic theory put forth by a researcher, which is Lencioni's model of high-performing teams. And this suggests the idea that if you look at high-performing teams, you're going to find common traits. And in particular, you'll find 5 common traits that emerge from these high-performing successful teams. And those traits are trust, conflict, crazy, I know, but we'll discuss, commitment, accountability, and results. According to Lencioni's model, trust is that basis, that foundation. That's the root of the start of any high-performing team. If you don't have that basis of trust, you can't achieve the other objectives. And with trust, this is the confidence that team members have in each other, their willingness to be vulnerable to each other, their belief that they're well-intended, that their team members are capable, and that they're reliable, and that they do what they say they're going to do. Beyond trust is conflict. And you might be scratching your head thinking, well, why would a high-performing team have conflict? Why would that be a trait of a high-performing team? Well, conflict in organizations is not always bad. And in fact, it is a positive thing when it's constructive conflict. Why? Because conflict results in constructive debates. You avoid groupthink. You avoid a bunch of people just going with the flow because the loudest person on the team has a big voice. It encourages discussions to make sure that they're going through the rational decision-making model and that they're examining all alternatives and that they're challenging each other to do the right things when it comes to leadership and decision-making as a team. High-performing teams are also committed. This means that the team members are in it to win it. They're all aligned with the team's goals. They're motivated and dedicated to achieving those goals. Accountability ensures that members hold each other accountable and they hold each other responsible. They don't allow someone to slack off. They're making sure everyone is performing and everyone is committed. And then finally, results. Results refer to that collective success. And in a team, the priority is that collective success as a team, not over any individual performance. As you just learned, conflict in organizations can be a positive thing. So let's dive a little deeper into the concept of organizational conflict and discuss how conflict can be beneficial to organizations, nonprofit and otherwise. Conflict is a central trait of high-performing teams. We just talked about how in Lencioni's model of high-performing teams, there are 5 traits. One of those traits of high-performing teams or high-impact teams is conflict. And it's important to understand, though, that conflict can be constructive if it is properly managed. And not only can it result in better team achievement, but it also can impact positive organizational benefits and result in personal growth for individuals on a team. The most effective nonprofit leaders don't stick their head in the sand and avoid conflict. Instead, they see it as the potentially positive thing that it is and that it can be. And they use their leadership skills to direct and channel that conflict in a positive direction. So what is conflict? It's simply a disagreement or discord or drama that arises from differences. People are people. Everyone is different. Even in a team of people who are generally like-minded, you're going to have individual and differing perspectives, interests, opinions, experiences, and sometimes those can create discord. So, when individuals, groups, or teams try to block or hinder or thwart someone else's attempts to achieve their objectives, that's the root of that conflict. Now, constructive conflict is a disagreement that's directed in a positive, constructive, and productive manner. And this can be a good thing. This leads to positive outcomes. It allows for diversity of perspectives. You're avoiding that group think. And as a result, you have more effective decisions and innovative ideas. And groupthink is something that happens when team members they start to conform. And usually in groups or teams, you have one loud voice, one charismatic personality, one dominating or domineering personality, and that person tends to kind of lord over that entire group or team. And as a result, the members of that group or team just kind of go along with what that leader or that big voice is saying. And that is dangerous. That's when you start to have group think. People don't feel like they're in a safe space to challenge that big voice or to challenge ideas. And they sit back meekly, and the team doesn't benefit from diverse viewpoints. So groupthink is a bad thing. Another bad thing is destructive conflict. This is a type of conflict or disagreement that instead of being focused on coming together to resolution and to achieve shared goals, it's about hostility and personal attacks. And as a result, that ultimately harms productivity and it damages relationships. The simple fact is conflict is unavoidable in organizations. When you've got different diverse people working together in groups and teams, conflict is going to happen. The difference is that conflict destructive or is it constructive? So let's talk about 5 common approaches that are used in organizations to manage conflict. Now, for conflict to be constructive, it has to be effectively managed. And this is why leaders really need to make an effort to understand their personal tendency of how they approach conflict or their conflict resolution style. Now, conflict resolution styles, we do generally tend to have a conflict style that we tend to adopt in most situations. But managing conflict and the approach we use to address conflict, it can vary on a situational basis. I generally try to use a compromising conflict resolution style, but depending on the situation, I might need to pivot and adopt a different style. So understanding the situational nature of conflict resolution is a pragmatic consideration. Just realistically, you're going to have to address conflict differently depending on the scenario. One way that we assess the way people address conflict is through the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode. This posits that there are 5 approaches to conflict resolution: compromising, collaborating, competing, avoiding, and accommodating. And if you were to plot these 5 styles on a graph, the x-axis measures how cooperative the approach is. Either it's uncooperative or cooperative with regard to concern for others' needs. And on the y-axis, you'll find the dimension of assertiveness, with the approach either being unassertive or assertive with regard to concern for one's own needs. A competing style is sometimes referred to as a win-lose approach. And this is a style where one party cares more and prioritizes their individual interests and goals over the other parties. So this is about, I'm going to win at the expense of you losing. This generally uses authority, power, domination, and assertiveness to win that conflict and come out the winner. An avoiding style is a lose-lose. This is a I'm going to stick my head in the sand approach. And this occurs when conflicting parties choose to avoid the conflict, dance around the conflict, or ignore it entirely. And the reason it's a lose-lose is because nobody can win if you're going to just avoid the problem completely. A collaborating style is generally recognized as a win-win scenario. This is where you try to have an outcome where both conflicting and competing parties come away from that conflict feeling like they've won, where it's working together to find a mutually beneficial solution. Now, a win-win solution is difficult sometimes because it requires a lot of things: open communication, active listening, a willingness to compromise and give up on your own individual needs to meet the needs of all the parties involved in that conflict. Accommodating styles is a lose-win approach. And this is a style where one party gives up their own needs and they're willing to take the L or lose in exchange for the preferences or needs of the other party. So the other party comes out a winner. Like the collaborating style, a compromising style is also known as a win-win. Compromising style is pretty similar to a collaborating style. But with a collaborating style, it's about working together and collaborating to come up with a solution where both parties feel like a winner. With a compromising style, It's not about collaborating, but rather it's seeking a middle ground where each party has to give up something. They realize I have to give up something on my own individual needs if I ever want to try to reach any sort of agreement with this other party. So it's not as kumbaya, it's not as collaborative, but it's about both parties giving up something to find a mutually agreeable solution. And this often involves negotiation. None of these approaches is better than the other. None is right or wrong. Each has pros and cons. And while individuals have a general conflict resolution style, the specific style that they approach to individual conflicts as they arise, that can vary. And I'll give you an example from my real life nonprofit experience. I generally try to adopt a collaborating style to conflict resolution. But I've had situations in my nonprofit experience where I would have a volunteer feel really strongly about something. For example, if I was planning our annual charity gala to raise money for the mission and I had to pick out a tablecloth color, I might have wanted a black tablecloth. But I've had situations where volunteers on the planning committee felt really strongly that they want something other than a basic, boring black tablecloth. And guess what? At the end of the day, I didn't really care. I cared about raising money. I didn't care about the color of the tablecloths. So when it came to a lot of those details of event planning, I often took an accommodating style. I didn't even need to take time to collaborate with them because I really didn't care. I had a slight preference, but I was willing to yield my own needs to adopt that accommodating style to let them select their own preferences to satisfy their needs because at the end of the day, it just really wasn't that important to me. And I've also had situations in nonprofits like negotiating a contract or a new lease agreement where I had to adopt a competing style. I had to take a pretty powerful, authoritative, aggressive, assertive stance when I was negotiating with a landlord on our office space lease in order to make sure that I won, meaning the nonprofit won, and not spending more money than we needed to on rent. So again, conflict resolution approaches can vary based on the situation, and they should. Now that we know that individuals have different approaches to addressing conflict, it's important to understand the role of personality because personality clashes can sometimes be the root of conflict. And understanding our own personality type and the 5 big personality traits that make up individual personalities can help us better navigate conflict in organizations and also everyday non-conflict situations. Personality refers to that grouping of characteristics, traits, patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that shape every individual, every human being. And we do tend to be fairly consistent with how we interact with other people and how we respond to things that are thrown at us in life. Most theorists agree on the concept that there are 5 core personality dimensions, and this is often referred to in academia as the Big Five or the Big Five personality traits, or sometimes the 5-factor model. And those 5 personality dimensions or personality traits are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Now, an easy way to remember these big 5 personality traits is with the acronym CANOE, C-A-N-O-E, like I'm going to row a canoe. Again, CANOE is conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. So with these big 5 traits, it's all about people possessing a combination of these 5 traits. So it's not about necessarily identifying one dominant trait, but understanding how we can describe people's personalities using this mix of 5 traits and how each person's individual characteristics can vary in between each of those 5 traits. First is the C part of CANOE, conscientiousness. This refers to how responsible someone is, how dedicated they are, what their level of self-control is. People that are highly dependable, who follow through, who do whatever it takes to follow through on their word, who are super motivated, highly goal-oriented, they care a lot about doing a good job. These are people who are generally described as being highly conscientious. Agreeableness refers to someone's general concern for the social harmony. They are the people who generally like to get along with other people. They do a good job of compromising. Sometimes they're even great serving as mediators. They tend to have warm personalities. They're described as kind and cooperative in their interpersonal relationships. So highly agreeable people are those people that we generally like to be around. They're warm, they're harmonious, they're friendly. Neuroticism refers to a person's emotional stability. Highly neurotic people tend to be very emotionally reactive. They have a tendency to be negative, they're quick to anger, they're very anxious and nervous. They're kind of that gloomy Gus who's always looking at things from a negative perspective and living in gloom and doom and despair. And they really can't handle it well when they're faced with loss or with threatening situations. Openness to experience refers to an individual's willingness to be open to new ideas, new perspectives, experiences. They like thinking outside of the box. They're not closed off. They're not myopic and only seeing things one way, but they're open and they're willing to see the broader world around them. Extroversion relates to someone's social ease, how well they navigate external relationships and situations. They're not afraid to meet new people. They're not afraid generally to network in a crowd. They're not afraid to engage in public speaking and things like that. So the differences in personalities sometimes can serve as a source of conflict. So if you have a team of people, for example, and someone on the team is very high in neuroticism and they're always negative and woe is me, that can sometimes be a root of conflict for the team as a whole. That can drag that team down. So understanding what makes people tick and what comprises our individual personalities can help us navigate and understand that we're human beings, we're different, and that in group and team scenarios and in organizations, which are made up of groups and teams of people, we have to be willing to understand personality and people's differences and how they approach things and our different characteristics and navigate these differences in a mature, respectful, and leading type of way. So as you can see, conflict, not only is it unavoidable, but it actually can be a positive, healthy thing. But we have to understand and respect individual differences and individual and different personalities, especially in a nonprofit organization where you've got a lot of really passionate people coming together for a shared cause, all with their different personalities, all with their different approaches to conflict. But at the end of the day, it's about sharing in one thing, which is your quest to achieve the organizational mission.